Hello all, and welcome to the Crusades Part 2. The last time we talked about the Crusades, we did a little bit of event history and spent more time on the nature of the First Crusade and the causes of the background to the First Crusades, talking about the situation in the Middle East and the papacy and the ways in which it was trying to grow, evolve, and reform during the 11th century. We talked about the Crusades. It began with the papacy, and they took on a life of their own. They were extraordinarily violent, and we talked a little bit about violence. In terms of taking on a life of their own, on the way to the First Crusade, there were anti-Semitic pogroms in which Jews were massacred in the Rhineland in 1096. They started to manifest a sort of a Frankish pride. It's too early in centuries like these to use a word such as nationalism. We think of that as a 19th century event, not in this course, but certainly some sort of proto-national identity pride some people have detected developing. We didn't talk too much about Greek Christians beyond that the Fourth Crusade sacked Orthodox Christianity. The Children's Crusade was a tragedy, and the Crusader states were this entity in the Levant that existed from the capture of Jerusalem in 1099 up to the end of the 13th century. So with that quick review of that, today we want to talk about why, or rather, let me go first to consequences. More than 900 years after the Crusades took place, this expression of Christian aggression and piety continues to elicit controversy. In the popular imagination, the Crusades represent an infamous symbol of religious zeal coupled with unfettered violence, and are frequently invoked as a pre-modern antecedent to the clash of civilizations between Christianity and Islam. In academic settings, historians debate exactly what constituted a crusade, where are their origins. I did a little bit of that going back with the indulgences and papal banners last time, right? And also they think about what are the precise characteristics that distinguish crusaders from other types of warriors or from pilgrims. One thing is certain. Among those who study the Crusades in European history, a widespread sense persists that the First Crusade tells us something crucial about the formation of medieval Christendom, and by extension, the nature of Europe itself. Among the, it's widely recognized that there are really important consequences. Among them, I'm not really putting out, what I'm going to do here is give a laundry list of some of the things that have been identified or argued are consequences of the Crusades. Without giving too much commentary, so that we can go on and talk about the area that I want to focus on the most. But do we see increased contact from the East and West? Do we see increased intolerance in the wake of it? The attitudes of Christians towards Jews and Christians towards Muslims, do they harden and worsen? Certainly, we will see in the 11th, 12th century going onward, more anti-Semitism in Europe, and the crystallization of something that, if it used to be referred to as anti-Judaism, we don't like you because you're responsible for Christ's death, you didn't accept Christ, you turned Christ over to the Romans, didn't accept his death. But if you convert, great. That morphs into something that we call anti-Semitism, that no matter what your religion is, there's something essential about Jews that is reviled among many Christians in medieval Europe. We'll talk about that. That's anti-Semitism. Case in point, Jews that converted to Christianity in many 13th century churches had special rows in which they had pews designated for them. That right there is evidence that it isn't just about religion. you've joined the Christian community, but we still hold you a bit apart. Anyway, and do we see more intolerance towards heretics and the other? Another consequence, and I think here I will editorialize. This one's for reals. The papacy loses face in the wake of the Crusades. If it started by this, in some ways, really ambitious vying for power, in the end, I think it doesn't work out that way for Rome. And instead, we see states emerging as entities that we can really track. Some see in it the rise of the West and a consummate Byzantine Empire in decline, not so much because of the West, but because of the Seljuk Turk Ottomans coming in. It's very much understood that the Crusades overall, and certainly after that disastrous Fourth Crusade, were detrimental to East-West relations, which is sort of ironic since it all started out as a kind of help mission. And then also the part I want to think about and talk about with you today is the changed nature of Christian piety. So we're going to end by talking about apocalyptic thinking and representations of Christ. So that's a bit of a laundry list of ways in which consequences of the Crusades, but I haven't really dealt with causes. This why is still out here. And why do the Crusades happen? As we talked about last time, certainly it starts with the papacy, and it has something to do with papal authority, as the papacy is vying to sanction and determine what is appropriate violence, and it makes this Christendom-wide call, or for Latin Christendom, to engage in this endeavor. Some have asked if it's defensive. Well, maybe on the Byzantine side, yes, they are trying to defend themselves and ask for help, but was Latin Christianity threatened by the Seljuk Turks in this moment? I think the answer is no. That's a weak sauce argument to my mind. Other considerations have been greed. Was it economic? That they went and conquered these cities that were economically more advanced, more commercially vibrant, and brought back booty? Well, maybe, but on the whole, maybe relative to the effort, not so much booty was brought back. And in fact, it cost quite a bit to organize an army to go to the Holy Land for a crusade. So certainly maybe economics has something to do with it, but I think it isn't the whole story. There's also this, is it an early case of European imperialism? Well, maybe, and we'll talk about imperialism in the early modern world. So maybe later in the course, you might think more about how what happens here. Is this imperialism? Yes or no? Why or why not? An earlier theory that had circulated for a long time and is now, I think, largely debunked. It is largely debunked. It was this idea of primogeniture theory, drawing on the word, drawing even on the reported words of urban speech, this idea that there's all these second sons, second, third sons in Europe that need something to do, need a sort of release valve, and so we'll send them off into the Holy Land and fight so that things can stay more peaceful here. And by the way, they'll make their fortune there. For the most part, it wasn't second sons that went, and so that theory has been largely debunked. And some people kind of naively through some lenses would say this was about devotion. And I think that in the 19th century, indeed, that was an interpretation that one encountered. And indeed, in the 19th century, many historians said there was this millennialism afoot, or in the 19th century, historians looking at the 11th century looked at the sources and said there's this millennialism afoot, this apocalyptic thinking. And then through much of the 20th century, I think that the historians coming at the work of history with a very secular attitude and a real or coming at it with a real secular attitude, had maybe a hard time imagining that devotion would be the real reason, and that rather it was maybe masking some other ambition or motivation, such as motivation for money. People in the 20th century really understand economic motivation as a motivation, and that's where we saw more of these economic explanations of the Crusades. Well, I think that the pendulum, as it often does in historical interpretation, is swinging back the other way. And now more historians will find a sort of middle ground and very much see a real, although to editorialize, we might not relate and find it to be a deeply problematic religious zeal, but real religious zeal in what's taking place here. And it's in that perspective that I sort of want to make the bulk of my comments in this thinking about the Crusades and why they happened. And in doing this, I'm drawing very much now on the historian J. Rubinstein and his interpretation, someone who's read all these crazy, hard to understand sources and helped us see and how apocalyptic thinking was very much at work. So two of his books are Armies of Heaven, The First Crusade and the Quest for Apocalypse, that came out in 2011. And then 2019, Nebuchadnezzar's Dream. That's an allusion to a moment in the book of Daniel that deals with the Crusades, apocalyptic prophecy, and the end of history. So if you want to read more, in addition to the Dominion of God that I showed you in the last lecture, I would recommend these to you. So when we think about the Crusades, one of the questions that J. Rubinstein attempts to answer is, why was it so violent? This was an unusually violent event, and one of the ways in which he explains it is that it has to do with apocalyptic thinking. And here in his explanation goes deep into the book of Revelations. Now, in the Gospels, Christ predicts to his disciples that the end of days is approaching and will bring about a great tribulation marked by war, pestilence, famine, and the appearance of false prophets. He also declares that his message of salvation will be preached throughout the entire world and will reach all of its peoples before the consummation of history. Although this promised course of events did not come about quickly, as his followers were no doubt expecting initially, subsequent generation of believers continued to anticipate the eventual fulfillment of their Messiah's words. And over the following centuries, a distinctly Christian apocalyptic scenario developed that included the universal spread of the gospel before the coming of the false Messiah, Antichrist, his persecution of the elect, and his ultimate defeat with Christ's victorious return in final judgment. The devil, so to speak, was in the details. The earliest Christians vigorously debated the nature of those last things, those last days, including the question of whether there would be a millennial age of peace and prosperity on earth before the end, or if it would come more quickly. Now, as the year 1000 approached, the millennialism, the first millennial of Christendom, being 1,000 years, made people start to think more, are we at the ends of times now? And there was this notion, and so we see that monks and scribes are returning increasingly to this idea of the apocalypse. And the apocalypse even comes from a Greek word meaning lifting the veil or revelations. The book of Revelations, let me not interpret the book of Revelations, but it's the last book of the last testament. And this is where so much of this apocalyptic imagery comes from, about which exegetes debate the interpretations of over time. So I don't want to get drawn into any of those debates for sure, but apocalypse is this term meaning the lifting of the veil. It's a term applied to the disclosure to certain privileged persons of something hidden from the majority of humankind. And if you know in your current life, evangelicals are one, then you know that this sense that you have access to some secret knowledge to which most people are denied and don't know is a very strong sense of that identity, that you have secret knowledge that most people don't have. Anyway, today the term apocalypse, which we're hearing way too much in 2020, is often used to refer to the end of the world. But that sense was the revelation at the end of times. So here's a frontispiece of a 9th century book of Revelations where much of this comes from. Now, Revelations has been around for a long time. It was probably written around the time of the Gospel of John later, but near the end of the 1st century. It took longer than other books to get into the Latin canon, and some Eastern religions don't accept the book of Revelations as canonical. At any rate, Revelations had been around for a long time. Church fathers like Augustine, however, had said, this is a book to be read in a spiritual, that is not a literal manner, and that it was better to take counsel from, according to Augustine, the Gospel of Matthew, who wrote in chapter 4, verse 36, that of that day and hour no one knows, not the angels of heaven, but the Father alone. Or to look to the Acts of the Apostles, where it says, it is not for you to know the times or moments. So those were really important exegetical voices, Augustine quite an authority to say, hey, the end of times is coming, but it's not your job to be marking the calendar about it. And so it isn't a big deal. But around the 11th century, it does become more of a big deal for many monks and scribes. The idea occupies more of the writing of exegetes. Why? Well, that year 1000 came around, and then the year 1030. The 1000 came and went, but it was on the minds of scribes. The year 1033 was the millennial anniversary of the execution of Christ, a big date for church history. And so it took this information in the pre-cyber age a lot longer to go viral. So, in the second half of the 11th century, it's still it's trending on people's minds, so to speak. These notions of the end of time approaching focus attention on Jerusalem, the Holy Grail, to mix relics of the Crusades, because there's this sense that the end of the real action at the end of times, whoever's returning or whatnot, is going to happen in Jerusalem. And so we see interest in Jerusalem rising. There's much imagery of Jerusalem at the center of the world. In various medieval places. There's collections of medieval maps that place Jerusalem at their center, and you can find lots of these kind of circular, they're even often referred to as crusade maps that have Jerusalem center of the world. Maybe not geographically, but in terms of spiritual importance, Jerusalem is where it is at. Also, Jay Rubenstein has pointed out that as the evidence for this rising interest in Jerusalem in the 11th century isn't only something found on manuscript pages, but also in the built world, that in the 11th century in Western Europe, more round chapels are attached to European churches in an imitation, Rubenstein argues, of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. And then here, by the way, just to show you, this is a much later crusade image where we have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Dome of the Rock, a 7th century mosque built, and then some town ramparts. This is the old quarter of Jerusalem, and this is where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is. Here is the Dome of the Rock, and there's a picture of that mosque that was born. By the way, I thought I would just show you this. Here is a timeline in the different colors. Here's a timeline of Jerusalem, one of the oldest continually occupied by human sites in history that we know of. And these colors indicate the religion when. The yellow, and this is going back to 2000 BC, about here, where you had the yellow indicates a non-Abrahamic religion. Then the blue indicates Hebrew or Jewish. Red indicates Christian. Green indicates Muslim. And these are different entities after in the short-lived unity of the Caliph in the 7th century. And then under the Crusades, so this is the period right here when we are in when the Crusader kingdoms exist, and it is a Christian entity. So that's a little bit about the importance of Jerusalem in apocalyptic thinking, and Crusades are happening. Pardon me, pilgrimages are happening. For example, I mentioned this pilgrimage of the year 64-65, and what I said to you last time was that one pilgrim recorded that after they were ambushed by the Seljuk Turks, who were Sunnis, and then a brigade of Shiite Egyptian Muslims came along and saved them. The pilgrim recorded, it was miraculous. Satan cast out Satan. And the point I made to you there was that that's a sobering indication for and revealing about how these Christians viewed Muslims. Satan cast out Satan. I bring this up again because that crusade, that pilgrimage in 1064 was pretty popular. It was a pretty big caravan, and one of the reasons, one of the senses was there was a big belief that the earth, that the end might be coming that year. And it had to do with a peculiarity of the liturgical calendar. So in all this apocalyptic thinking that had developed over the centuries, there was this idea that when the Annunciation, that's when the angel came to Mary and said, you are going to birth Christ. When the Annunciation and Good Friday fell on the same day, the Annunciation was always on March 25th, but Good Friday moved because depending on how they did the calendar, and calendars were a really big deal. So in a year where they fell on the same day, that was a year where not definitely, but it was a year more likely to have the apocalypse. And that made it an even bigger year for pilgrimage. Another indication of this focus on the end times coming that we see in the 11th century. This focus on the end times is what enabled, Rubinstein argues, that enabled Christians to see Saracens not as people, but as Antichrist. So what is a Saracen? A Saracen wasn't just a Muslim. A Saracen was an embodiment of the Antichrist, an incarnation of Satan in the flesh. And it was this vision of the existence of an Antichrist in the Saracens for whom redemption was impossible. These are not people that can find Christ. These are not people that can come to Christ at all. And it was that set of ideas that allowed a message of love for all humanity to be subordinated to this vision of the end of times and give way to an idea that these people should be killed. There's a notion that this most holy city of Jerusalem, in order to be purified, Christians should commit an act of genocide and rid all of the Antichrist from that city. We, as reasonable, modern, post-Holocaust human beings can only listen to that sort of logic spelled out with a degree of horror. Annihilating an entire population and counting it as a virtue, killing in preparation for the end of times as a good thing, it is a horrific notion. Of course, that's the way I've always put it. Before, in 2017, in a Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, Nazi slogans of blood and soil and morphing and Jews will not replace us were chanted on American soil in 2017. And in 2018, 11 Jews were massacred at the Tree of Life synagogue by an anti-Semitic terrorist, Robert Bowers. That happened in October 2018. And in 2019, according to the Homeland Security Newswire, the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the United States of America, reported on the dangers of white supremacist terrorists animated by ideas of accelerationism, the idea that moving towards a violent race war would be a good thing. And it makes me think that these events in the past few years makes me think that perhaps I had been too convinced of the virtues of ideas of freedom and rationality in contemplating the horrific notions of genocide as a good thing previously. But I will still editorialize unashamedly that that even if a fascination with and adherence to violent conflagration and elimination of groups of people whole stock exists, these are ideas that should not exist in a republic based on rule of law and equality before the law. That irrational thinking can move people to take dramatic and violent actions and be driven by notions that don't accord with a principle such as liberty and justice for all is no great insight to make. And that indeed is not my point. So, because I trust that you already know that. Instead, I want to make this a point about religion and perhaps the changing nature of Christianity. And I'd submit to you that studying the Crusades deeply and understanding what is driving people in these events helps us better appreciate the changing nature of Christianity, and perhaps perhaps by transitive property, but it would take, of course, more study, the changing nature of religion generally. As I talked to ideas about the end of times, they've always been there. In the sacred scripture, it's been there all along. But human communities have decided how much focus and attention they give to it over time. And we've seen ebb and flow. So in some ways, perhaps it's another lesson in the texts are important, but they never give us the whole story when we study that, when we're trying to understand the past. It's why we need to do more study and understand the context. But here, what do I mean about the changing nature of religion? On the other side of the Crusades, we start to see Christ represented quite differently than we did previously. And here I'm going to just show you some quick visuals that I think help make a point fairly strongly. As we talked about in the ancient world and the emergence of Christianity, these are some of the first visual representations of Christ, represented him as the good shepherd, drawing on a part of the gospel where he will go out of his way, endangering himself and the greater flock to bring one stray sheep back. And that also, as I mentioned, had resonance with other pagan motifs. A few centuries in, we see images of Christ that we might call Christ militant. The militant, Christ militant mosaic here on the left at the church in Ravenna in northern Italy. It was commissioned by a bishop in the late 5th century. Christ is dressed as a Roman legionary. He wears a purple tunic, the symbol of royalty, so not humility, so to speak. He bears a cross on his shoulder. He's young, he's beardless. He holds a gospel that shows a passage from John 14 saying, I am the way, truth, and life. Thou shalt tread upon the lion and adder, the young lion and the dragon shalt thou trample under feet. So that's a fairly aggressive message, and we see an aggressive warrior Christ. Even this, and this image from a church, I think this maybe in Spain, shows a Christ that is rigid. He is not collapsed on himself. He is rigid. He is looking forward. Even in crucifixion, there is something aggressive and strong about him. In the wake of the Crusades, and although Jerusalem was taken in 1099, but no subsequent crusade was as successful. The Fourth Crusade was pretty much a disaster, and in the end, the papacy takes a hit in terms of its moral authority in large measure. As we start to see the Renaissance emerging and what we count as Renaissance art, images of Christ are quite different. We see images of Christ suffering. Here's Michelangelo's favorite, famous Pietà, made in the end of the 15th century. But more and more, and when we see Christ on the cross, we see him human and suffering and submissive. And so just these images indicate, nothing in the theology changes, but the way in which Christ, central figure in Christianity, gets emphasized does change. Well, finally, we might, I'll just make a final comment, thinking about effects of the Crusades and the Crusades in religion. What effects does the Crusade have on other religions? Well, the historian Carol Hillebrand has written that one consequence of the Crusades was to introduce a revived and more militant emphasis on a militant jihad in Islamic religion. Now, and Jake Rubenstein, in this article that he published in J. Rubenstein, kind of for a public audience, not so scholarly, but he published this article, short article, in 2012, Crusade versus Jihad, which is worse? And in that, he makes this point, or you can read it here. The short answer is no, the Muslims weren't more brutal. But the point other historians have made is that when the spread of Islam occurred, it occurred rapidly, spreading in political weak areas. And when subjects were conquered, they weren't killed. They would pay the divi. Actually, it was set up to protect people of the book, and that also brought revenue. And there was, and often if labor was short, there were all kinds of incentives not to kill people, but rather to enslave them. Although, if your only source listening about this, if you'll recall from our last lecture, was the reports of Pope Urban II's speech in 1095, his call for the Crusades, you could be forgiven for thinking differently, because in that incendiary speech, he describes some horrific violence that Muslims committed. Well, at any rate, Muslim warfare in its first centuries was characterized far more by enslavement, not massacre, of the conquered. And the Christian Crusaders, however, modeled a different, more murderous type of warfare, and their victims took note. And historians tell us that Muslim atrocities